close your eyes and listen. You hear the distant hum of Newark's foghorns, the rhythmic screech of the subway tunneling beneath Manhattan, and the relentless, frantic pace of millions of feet hitting the pavement in Times Square. This is New York, the unofficial capital of the world, a monster of steel and glass that never sleeps. But what if we could turn back the dial? What if we could peel back the layers of asphalt, scrape away the concrete, and erase the skyscrapers until only the raw, jagged edges of the island remain?
Let me take you back over 360 years to the year 1660. The sounds of the city then aren't engines and sirens, but the rhythmic thud of a shipbuilder's mallet, the rustle of ancient oak forests, and the splash of the Atlantic against a pristine shoreline that the Lapi people knew by names recorded early on as Mannahatta, later often rendered more poetically as Mannahatta or Mannahatta. At the very southern tip of that island, a strange tiny town is rising, defined by steep Dutch gables and windmills turning lazily in the sea breeze. Welcome to New Amsterdam. This wasn't just a settlement, it was a mega city in embryo, the place where the DNA of ambition, diversity, and cold, hard pragmatism first combined to create the American soul. In this video, powered by AI Reconstruction based on the famous 1660 Castello Plan, we are dabbing into the muddy streets of New Amsterdam at its peak to understand why this tiny outpost was the blueprint for every global metropolis today. We begin our journey at the absolute southern tip, where Fort Amsterdam stands as a silent sentinel over the Hudson River. Imagine yourself standing on these earth and stone ramparts. This wasn't a majestic European castle designed for glory. It was a gritty, multi-purpose complex, part military barracks, part fur warehouse, part administrative nerve center. Here, Director General Peter Stvarent, the man with the silver-banded wooden leg, stands gazing out at the harbor. Stvarent wasn't a polished politician. He was an executive of the Dutch West India Company, and New Amsterdam, at this moment, was essentially a corporate startup. Inside the fort, you'd see a calculated chaos. Clerks are frantically inventorying beaver pelts, the brown gold of the 17th century, destined for the markets of Europe. Arguments erupt in a dozen different languages: French from Huguenot refugees, German, English, and of course the guttural businesslike Dutch of the ruling class. Just outside the fort's gates is a broad common area, an open patch of ground used for markets and gatherings. The space later formalized under the English as Bowling Green in the 18th century. Today, that later park is near the Charging Bull of Wall Street. But in 1660, this was simply the town's outdoor living room, where cattle might be sold, news was exchanged, and residents found a little room to breathe. This was the political and social heart of the town, where life and death decisions for the colony were hashed out over wooden tables stained with beer and tobacco smoke. Leaving the stern atmosphere of the fort, we walk along Pearl Street, the artery that hugs the East River shoreline. Why Pearl? Because in those days, the Manhattan coast was littered with oyster shells that shimmered like pearls in the sun. This is the district of the elite, the merchant princes of the New World. Look at the houses here. If you were expecting the crude log cabins of typical frontier movies, prepare to be surprised. The Dutch brought Amsterdam across the ocean with them. These houses are narrow and tall, featuring brilliant red and yellow brick facades and stepped gables that reach for the sky. Some of those bricks weren't baked here. They could arrive as cargo or even as ballast in the holds of Atlantic ships. For a wealthy merchant like Cornelius Steinwich, a house wasn't just a shelter. It was a billboard for his prosperity. Step inside and the luxury is staggering. Intricate Persian rugs on the floors, blue and white porcelain from China displayed on mantels, and heavy oak cabinets filled with meticulous ledgers. In New Amsterdam, status wasn't measured by noble titles, but by your global reach. Who were you in the Dutch Worldwide Trade Network? That was the only question that mattered. But New Amsterdam wasn't just for the wealthy. Let's turn on to Stone Street, the first street in the city, to be paved after residents petitioned for it and helped pay for the work because the mud and dust of daily life was swallowing the town whole. Here we find the real soul of the city, the taverns. By the mid-7th century, observers were already remarking, sometimes complaining, that taverns were everywhere, an outsized share of the town's life and buildings devoted to drink. Why so many? Because here, the tavern was the community center, the brokerage office, and the newsroom all in one. Imagine stepping into a tap house at sunset. The air is thick with the smell of roasted meat and smoke from long clay pipes. A sailor from the Caribbean is telling tales of sugar-laden ships. A German craftsman is arguing over timber prices with a farmer from Long Island. New Amsterdam was performing a social experiment never seen before. Practical tolerance. When the first Jewish refugees arrived in Manhattan in 1654, fleeing persecution in Brazil, Stuyvesant wanted to expel them, but the company directors in Holland overruled him and allowed them to remain less from lofty ideals than from a hard-eyed practical calculus. That was the moment the pattern was set. New Amsterdam became a place where your private faith mattered less than your ability to contribute to the economy. This is the origin of the multiculturalism that New York wears as a badge of honor today. Now look up at the windmills turning on the high ground. They weren't just iconic Dutch scenery, they were machines that helped keep a growing town alive, grinding grain, pumping, and supporting the work of builders and shipwrights. The screech of saws, the thump of hammers, and the whistling of the wind through canvas sails created a proto-industrial symphony. New Amsterdam was a city of makers and doers. Everyone was in a state of hustle, and fittingly, even the word's roots trace back to Dutch. They didn't build massive cathedrals or monuments to gods. They built infrastructure. They built wharves, dikes, and practical waterways. Most famously, a canal cut through the middle of town so boats could reach the warehouses more directly. Broad Street today was once that canal, the Herft. Imagine small boats laden with furs and grain gliding between rows of brick houses, creating a kind of working Venice. Less romance than logistics, and all the more revolutionary for it. However, this prosperity had shadows that we cannot ignore. New Amsterdam was a deeply layered society. At the bottom were enslaved people brought from other colonies or directly from Africa. Yet under Dutch rule, many held a strange legal status called half-freedom. They could own land and marry legally, but were still required to work for the company when called upon, and their lives remained bound to a system of coercion. Among the earliest recorded black landholders in New Amsterdam held small farms north of the town around what is now Greenwich Village, lands that also served as a kind of buffer zone in a tense frontier world. The relationship with the Lapi was one of constant tension. The fur trade brought immense profits, but the encroachment of settlers on ancestral land led to bloody conflicts. This is why we must head north to the town's most significant military structure, the Wall. The Wall was a palisade and earthwork thrown up in fear, wooden trunks and defensive work stretching from the East River to the Hudson. Plans called for heavy posts that could be as long as 12 ft, but the barrier itself functioned as a rough fortification, not a towering stone rampart. It was the final boundary of European civilization on the island. On the other side of that wall lay the wilderness, the buries or farms and the lands of the indigenous people. Citizen soldiers, the bakers, smiths, and merchants patrolled the dirt path. Running alongside this wall, muskets is at the ready. Yet the great irony of history is that this wall never stopped a major land invasion. Instead, in 1664, the threat came from the sea. A small English squadron, 4 warships among it, appeared in the harbor. Their cannons aimed directly at the fort and the fragile houses. Stuyvesant wanted to fight, but the merchants of the city did what they did best. They calculated. They realized a war would destroy their businesses and their investments, and so, under pressure from his own people, Stuyvesant signed the Articles of Surrender. The wall was eventually torn down to allow the city to grow, and the path next to it became the financial center of the world. Wall Street. Though the name New Amsterdam only lasted 40 years, its legacy is eternal. When the English took over and renamed it New York to honor the Duke of York, they couldn't erase the Dutch spirit. They inherited a place already shaped by commerce and diversity. And they learned quickly that a loose trade-driven system could keep the city humming. New York remained unusually pluralistic for an English colony, even as later laws and politics complicated the reality of religious freedom. That is why New York has always been different from austere Boston or quiet Philadelphia. New York is the child of a corporation raised on profit and diversity. Looking at the map of Lower Manhattan today, you still see the crooked, narrow streets, the ghost of the Dutch property lines. The apartment lifestyle of modern Manhattan is an evolution of those narrow 17th century houses. Even the most American icons like cookies or Santa Claus are gifts from the residents of New Amsterdam. New Amsterdam solved the puzzle we still struggle with today. How do people from all over the world with different languages and beliefs live together in a crowded space? Their answer wasn't a grand speech about liberty, but a practical deal. If we can trade and prosper together, we can live together. Rome was built on the sword, but New York was built on a contract. That's why when you stand at Battery Park today and look out at the harbor, you aren't just seeing the past. You are seeing the beginning of the modern world where the lines between nations blur in the face of global trade. We have just finished a circuit of New Amsterdam in 1660. From the bricks of Pearl Street to the cannons of the fort, every square inch of this soil tells a story of survival and ambition. New Amsterdam may have vanished from the maps, but it lives in the pulse of every New Yorker, in the frantic energy of the stock exchange, and in the openness of a city that always welcomes a stranger looking to make their fortune. Have you ever wondered what New York would look like today if the Dutch had never surrendered? Would it be a Venice of the West with canals, or would it still be the industrial giant we know? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to let us know which historical location should we bring to life with AI next. Thank you for joining us on this trip back in time. We'll see you in our next historical reconstruction, where the past is not just words on a page, but a living, breathing experience.